If you're studying American history, chances are you've heard of the Gilded Age, a time which embodied the American dream, a time where American business boomed but unemployment soared. A new generation of Americans, who had lived through the horrors of the Civil War, were now being forced to adjust to a radically different world. Everything was different. But what actually was the Gilded Age? You see, Mark Twain coined the phrase to describe how he saw the US. To Twain, America may have seemed like an industrial powerhouse from the outside, a country where a regular working man could even become the president. But if you look closely, the nation had its roots in the sand. Although Twain did have a tendency to over-exaggerate just to prove a point, but it is true that there were deeply entrenched issues found in post-Civil War America, none of them as obvious as the mass unrest the war itself caused. America had money. Correction. Americans had money. Wait, no, correction. Some Americans had money. When historians examine the Gilded Age, they often talk about the top 1% of the top 1%, whose names we still talk about today. Rockefeller, the world's first billionaire, Carnegie, the steel titan who represented the American dream as an immigrant, and the man who led the world to the West, Cornelius Vanderbilt. These men were rich. There's no two ways about that, but they were outliers. Famously, Rockefeller held a monopoly of the oil industry and would simply buy out his competitors. While some might take the freedom approach and say, that's just the beauty of business, people make money, some people don't, others understand that this highlights an underlying problem with American society at the time. Many immigrants came from Britain and Europe with the hope of making a new life for themselves, just as Andrew Carnegie had, but instead were met with poor working conditions and low pay. Carnegie didn't have to worry about his steel workers striking, as where would they go instead? The 1892 Homestead strike was undermined entirely as Carnegie simply had the money to hire the Pinkertons, yes, the Pinkertons, as armed guards to stop any violent strikes from happening. It is, to be fair, worth noting that the Pinkertons failed, but it still says a lot that the man was so rich he could basically pay people to stop him from paying his workers more. You see, these wealthy elite, often called robber barons, had the ear of the government. They voted with their dollars and business-friendly Republicans, with a laissez-faire approach, kept being elected in. Ulysses S. Grant himself was famously involved in at least a dozen scandals, from liquor tax and gold market scams, so much so that the term Grantism is recognised in America today to refer to an incompetent president. It wasn't just Grant though. You had every president from Hayes to Harrison, all participating in acts of patronage, which meant that jobs were given out based on loyalty and as rewards rather than for merit. Some could argue that James Garfield, for as much as he tried, would have reformed these corrupt systems had Charles Guiteau not stuck a bullet into his back in 1881, and maybe his doctor had remembered to wash his hands before surgery. But if we're being honest, we won't ever know. And unfortunately, every US president, even Garfield himself, were involved in these corrupt systems. So yeah, America, to the surprise of almost no one, was rife with corruption. Money ruled during the Gilded Age, and only the few had it. The unstable economy meant that people would lose their jobs constantly, as the country was thrown into mass economic panic in both 1873 and 1893. And these issues of instability would only worsen as Americans began to look westward. Yeehaw! Western expansion during the Gilded Age was exactly what it said on the tin. Vanderbilt's railroads allowed for Americans to travel westward and to live their American dream. And if their dream was to be poor and live through some of the harshest droughts and financial disasters in American history, then they would have achieved it. It was clear, however, for almost everyone living in the West, that things were not the way they had been originally sold. The land, whilst not entirely lawless like in the movies, was unforgiving. Cholera and typhoid fever were not uncommon, and many settlers were not willing to share the land with the Native Americans who had been forced further and further west for years. The West itself was gilded as the harsh conditions drove many settlers back to the east, which sparked a new wave of urbanisation in the north, coming in further in the 1890s. There's a reason that so much of the American land is empty throughout the western states. It's because white Americans kicked out the only people who knew how to live on that land. Back in 1862, Lincoln had tried to drive Americans west by saying, if you go live in the West, you'll be given 160 acres of land. All you have to do is live on it. I know that might have sounded great, but a lot of people couldn't live on it. You know, this was land which belonged to the Native Americans. They were the only ones who knew how to live on this land. And so many people who had originally started going out west in order to fulfill the Homestead Act end up coming back with nothing. The theme of the Gilded Age is just how amazing everything seemed, but how terrible it actually was. You had Americans who had lived their whole lives thinking that they could be something, they could be the president, being just disappointed at every stage of their life. Some Americans got angry about this. President William McKinley, to many people, represented that old Gilded Age. You know, he was quite a large man, as some might put it, and a lot of his policies were favouring the rich. He famously introduced the McKinley tariffs, and that didn't help the workers at all. And some could say you couldn't even blame Leon Czolgosz for shooting McKinley in 1901, because he too was a descendant of these immigrants who came to the country wanting more during the Gilded Age, just to be disappointed and told that the money would just eventually trickle down to them, but it never did. And this is the issue with the Gilded Age, the importance of an entire 30 years of American history, because it represented how America would run itself in the future, how America would be divided entirely by this idea that everything is great and you don't need to look past the greatness to the people who lived behind that greatness. America was divided, and I mean it is today. We see it on the news all the time, and the Gilded Age is a perfect example of how this isn't a new thing. America always had this division, and it would only get worse as the dawn of the 20th century arrived. As I said, President William McKinley was assassinated in 1901 by Leon Czolgosz, as he had lost his job in the Panic of 1893, which meant the death of a president was a direct result of people's anger towards the Gilded Age. So some might say that Mark Twain was right when he said that America was fake, it was false, it had this identity that was manufactured by the American government, by the rich, the top 1%. Some could say that America was a country for that top 1%, and everyone else was there to help them get to that stage. And so it is there, with the death of another American president, that a new era for American history begins. The Gilded Age would end really within the late 1890s, but its effects carried on up until even World War I, when these new immigrants coming in from countries like Germany back in the Gilded Age were now seen as terrorists, people who supported the German regime. And so the Gilded Age, even years after it ended, is still an incredibly important part of American history.